Hello and welcome to the Canine Decoded Show. Today I have Sada, or Sadai, I think. she can correct me later, as a guest. And this is a highly anticipated episode because it's going to be all about shelter dogs, how they get into shelters, what they do in shelters, what happens to them in shelters, and how we get them out of it. Sada, you got a lot of questions or comments, and I got a lot of comments on the post that I posted in anticipation for this. So I went through about 100 comments and tried to categorize basically the kind of questions. And they're all good questions. And of course, there's some going, a lot of them going in the same direction. I'm pretty sure a lot of people know who you are and what you do. So just as a smooth intro, why don't you very, very quickly introduce what you do, what your mission is, and then I have a lot of good questions for you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. You did absolutely say my name correctly, so thank you. But if not, that's okay too. It's a challenging name, and I acknowledge that. So I am a co-founder of Wolf Mother Canine. For those who don't know me or aren't familiar with our work yet, we do showcase a lot of our work on our Instagram page, and we are shelter dog behavior consultants. We are also canine fear and aggression specialists. So we bring both of these passions and specialties together. And our main goal, or our main mission and service that we provide, is that we contract with local municipal shelters in California to work with their behaviorally challenged dogs. And this often means they're euthanasia listed dogs. So dogs that are deemed unadoptable by shelter staff or management. And I come in and evaluate them. I work with them to hopefully get them on that path of adoption, or at least rescue placement down the road. And we do work with private clients. So that is a service that we offer as well. But by and large, our greatest passion and specialty is shelter behavior. It's such a different world working with these dogs in this industry that has so many challenges that we have to face day in and day out. Yeah.
Well, one of the first questions I have is, why shelter dogs? How did you get there? Not because obviously it's that there needs to be a lot of work implemented, but it's also a very emotional kind of work. And I think a lot of your followers and your audience, they always highlight that they're so glad that there's someone like you who does it, because it is so emotionally taxing. So probably two questions here, like why shelter dogs? What about it that makes you go through this emotional load? And how do you deal with the emotional load of working with shelter dogs?
That is an excellent question. So I did start working at shelters over 20 years ago. So a long time ago is when I first stepped foot in a shelter and really got involved in the behind the scenes interactions that these dogs have. But over the years, over my 20s and early 30s, I really focused on private clients. But it was really my last day of organic chemistry when I was earning my bachelor's, and I should have been paying attention, but I was looking for jobs. And there was an opening. I know, but I don't really use OChem. I thought that'd be okay.
Yes. For sure.
And I saw a job opening at a local shelter, and this shelter, much like many others, did not have a dedicated behavioral department. So the staff pretty much do everything from care, behavior work. They clean, they feed, they transport animals, they do adoptions. It's a lot. And they didn't even have a vet on staff either. So we had to contract with a local veterinarian in the area with their own clinic, so our shelter dogs could be provided that service. And I got the job. I walked in, and the first thing I realized was there were all these dogs sitting in the isolation row, and there really was no plan for them. So much like a lot of other shelters in California or throughout the nation, this shelter was designated no kill. So by local ordinance, the shelter had to have at least a 90% live release rate. So that means adoptions, transfers. We could not have more than a 10% euthanasia rate. Okay. But for some dogs that were deemed unadoptable, they just kind of sat there. And with this type of environment that we're working with dogs in, we could quickly see them wasting away. So I approached management and asked if I could take these dogs on as my project dogs and very quickly I could see that we were making amazing progress with these dogs that, again, there was no plan for them, but they weren't moving towards the pathway of behavioral euthanasia either. So I found more and more that we felt like we can make a bigger impact by providing this service to multiple shelters in our area. And we're growing to throughout the state and throughout the country as well. So for me, especially, I found that I really, really connected with these dogs on a personal level. So as you probably know, I'm not shy about speaking about my past or anything that's happened to me. And without getting into too much detail, I have dealt with my fair share of trauma growing up in my household, a very abusive household, leading up to sexual assault and getting diagnosed with mental illness. There was a lot that I saw in these dogs that really mirrored what I experienced in my life. So when I approached a cage or a kennel and I saw this dog that was baring teeth at me and growling at me and snapping, I felt pity. I saw that suffering. And that was very much a reflection of my behaviors as I was healing and rehabilitating myself in my own life, where an outsider could see these responses and say, you know, she's just bratty. She's just used to getting her way. And, you know, she's an angry person and she's just aggressive. But really, it was just a lot of pain inside. And that was a manifestation of it. And working with these dogs one-on-one and really just kneeling down and introducing myself to a specific dog, it becomes almost a sacred moment between us. And in this darkness, we can form these bonds. And that was so transformative in my own life that I knew I was absolutely where I needed to be. And seeing the absolute need for this, not just in our state or in our area, but throughout the country and throughout the world, I knew there was a need for us to continue spreading this message, our experiences with these dogs, so we can change that mindset, change the optics, so people start to really understand what they're undergoing, what they are experiencing, so we can have a little bit more empathy when we work with them. And really try to understand what that is, what their reality is, because I feel that really is that first step in creating a better future for them. The babies.
So, yes. You know, this, I think is something that is very important. I think you talk about this a lot. The picture of the dog that you see in the shelter is not necessarily the dog that the person is going to adopt and will see at home in the living room. And I think that can go actually either way. That could go into worse or better, right? So what is your experience here, and how do you narrate or how do you educate people on what they see is not necessarily what they get?
Yes, I really try to paint a picture in a way that we either compare it to a dog they may have at home or even to themselves. So some people may call this anthropomorphizing, but I don't think there's a fundamental difference between how animals and how humans experience stress. So I paint this picture, say you were taken from your home and the routine that you have been familiar with for your entire life. You're now taken into this dark, loud, scary building. You're put in a tiny cage. So a lot of these kennels are maybe 6 feet by 3 feet, and that's all the dogs get. And you are inside of that kennel for upwards of 24 hours a day for some dogs. So a lot of shelters do struggle with volunteers or having enough staff members to provide adequate breaks from the kennel for all of their dogs. Or we have dogs that are not yet safe to remove. Maybe they're under protective custody. And we look at all of the things our dogs are able to do in our own home. So engage in these species-specific behaviors. And that ranges from even running 10 feet in front of you, jumping, playing, engaging in social interactions, either with people or with other dogs or animals that they enjoy. And really, I hammer this down a lot, the ability to rest. So dogs are polymorphic sleepers. They require multiple periods of rest throughout the day. We're not getting that with these shelter dogs. And when us as humans, we experience 1 or 2 nights of sleeplessness, man, that throws me off. Like my tolerance for anything goes so low that
Yeah.
Or if I'm hungry, if I have a headache, me as a human, I'm able to communicate this and hopefully get the help that I get. But shelters are in a position where we're having to warehouse these dogs in such high volumes that the standard of care goes down. And that's just the position that they're in. And it's not because they want to be malicious. It's just they're doing the best they can with the resources that they have. So as these dogs are undergoing day by day and we have strangers coming by in front of your tiny space that you can't escape from, what are the normal responses we would even experience for ourselves or expect from our own dogs? We would lose it. I mean, we would snap, we would yell and scream and really start displaying these stereotypies. So the spinning, the pacing, I see a lot of dogs licking the walls. And you may become what's labeled as aggressive because that is your only way of communicating. I'm feeling all of this distress and there's nothing I can do about it. There's no escape, no regulating it, no managing it. So when we're walking through these shelter halls and these kennel rows, as we're seeing these dogs that are quote unquote out of control or just rambunctious and too much, we really have to be mindful of what their experience has been for days or weeks or even months, years for some of these dogs, and really tailor what our expectations are according to what they're experiencing. And that, to me, is that cornerstone of a welfare-based approach in shelter behavior, is acknowledging that wellness and environment really changes how a dog behaves. That is such a cornerstone. We cannot separate wellness from behavior. And I think that's a really important point that we need to come to terms with, not just with our own dogs and in our homes, but especially with these shelter dogs.
Yeah. The welfare of dogs, the wellness of dogs, I think it has become more and more a topic in all kinds of areas, even police dogs and military dogs, where we now look more and more into, well, how do they live and are outside of the work, right? How can we provide just little things that makes it better? And it's very interesting because what I basically teach, or what I basically educate on, is the same thing: how stress or anything that isn't aligned with what the dog can deal with, or that isn't aligned with what is the optimal input, socialization, whatever it is for the dog, any kind of stress over time will put so much pressure on the brain and the organism that it will tilt towards aggression, right? So it will tilt towards behavior that are more destructive or seen as destructive. But for the dog, it's kind of like the outlet. And that happens with pet dogs at home, where it happens over months and years sometimes, because there are little things that we're not always aware of. Maybe there is a new baby in the household and that it's very new for the dog and it's very difficult for the dog because the dog is maybe not as social. So many things can happen. But with shelter dogs, that happens very, very quickly, that there's out of a sudden in such stressful environment, and it is such an overload on stress factors, that probably even the dogs that are super chill normally kind of crumble at some point, right? Or even the sweetest dogs more so than others, right? So what kind of dogs do you normally see and in your experience, if you know, what are the main reasons why they land or are being surrendered, why they land in shelters?
So by and large, the most frequent flyers in terms of breeds are Huskies, bully breeds. So that includes Staffordshire Terriers, American Pit Bulls, American Bullies, American Bulldogs, a lot of German Shepherds, cattle dogs. So the healer variations, we see a lot of Malinois now, which is very, very disappointing. And a lot of smaller ones too. So we do occasionally see golden retrievers or labs, but often small, white, fluffy Maltese poodles or Chihuahuas even. So it can be a little bit difficult getting the exact statistics on this, because the majority of dogs that come into shelters are strays. And oftentimes we cannot get a hold of the owner. So either the dog isn't microchipped, the microchip information is not up to date, the dog isn't licensed, it doesn't have a tag or any other means for the shelter to be able to successfully get in contact with the owners. And sometimes we do get in contact and they just never come and pick them up, or provide us with additional information that could help with the future placement of this animal.
Yeah.
But we do often see a trend with the owners that come in or guardians that are willingly surrendering their dogs. And it's a myriad of reasons. So we often see that a new landlord, so they're moving and the new landlord will not accept pets. There are people surrendering a lot of medical cases right now. So especially in the United States, throughout the country, we're seeing a shortage of veterinary services available, readily available and affordable to a lot of people. Mm-hmm. So we have a lot of wait lists or dogs that have more severe conditions that the people simply cannot afford to treat.
Yeah.
We are seeing a lot of dogs too surrendered for behavioral reasons, and due to the age that we're seeing them surrendered to, we are suspecting that a lot of these were COVID dogs that did not get socialized properly or have had enough positive exposure to different environments or people or other animals. So that really compounds the issue. Now we're not just seeing more and more dogs alone. They're carrying their own baggage too. And sometimes I do think it's because the novelty wore off. People got bored of the dog. It can be a highly impulsive decision for people to go out and buy one or adopt one if it's cheap or easy. And that is one of the discussions that I've had with multiple people is, should we be making dog ownership or guardianship easier or more challenging or difficult? Should we put up these barriers so they're not as easy to give up? And with rising inflation and the direction that the economy is taking, we're seeing more people lose their jobs, losing their housing. So there's all these different issues compounding and coming together. And it's definitely tempting to try to find one reason. Backyard breeders are another big problem that we're seeing. We see litters of puppies showing up now from the same areas time and time again. Mm-hmm. And we want that easy answer. We want to say there's just this one thing we need to fix and everything else will be easy. But I truly think there are multiple things going on in our communities, because what we're seeing in these shelters is a symptom of what's going on in the communities. It's not a shelter problem. It's a community problem that is now spilling over into the jurisdiction and care of these shelters. And they're struggling. We're struggling a lot. And there are services available for people that are having some challenges, whether it be behavioral or financial or housing. But everyone is stretched thin right now. Even rescues aren't pulling dogs. So we used to see lines out of the door when we had one puppy missing an eye with patches of fur. And now we have entire litters growing up. And I've heard studies, I don't know about dogs, but the impact, the physical changes that we see in the brain when young dogs or young humans experience chronic stress. And I can only imagine if we're seeing now more young dogs end up in shelters and stay in shelters longer, what physical changes are going on inside of them as well that we'll have to continue addressing even after they leave the shelters. So I think it is a very complex issue with a lot of different factors contributing to it. But those are, I feel, some of the most common responses or reasons that we are given in the shelters.
Yeah, that's okay. That brings up, well, I have two important questions that might be potentially controversial, but I would like to hear your thoughts on this. So, not just getting a dog from a breeder, but potentially even someone who wants to adopt a dog from a shelter. Do you feel like there is potentially an issue of the mindset that we have in the role that the dog will play in our lives? And no matter what, whether it's a hobby or it's you love animals or you want to go into competition, there is some selfishness in this. And that's okay, right? We want to have a dog to share our life with. And yet, sometimes there's, I want to help dogs. I want to get someone from a shelter or some dog from a shelter. I want to do good. In a certain way, you could still see that is some selfishness involved too, unless, you're really fully aware of like all the things that it may take, including the financial responsibility. But not just that. So my question is, do you think there is a problem in the mindset of the dog is supposed to make our lives nicer and make our walks more fun and heal our emotional wounds, without fully considering that it technically is a two-way street, and potentially if something happens and goes both ways, because not that the dog is the first thing that we throw out if really big issues happen. I'm pretty sure that for a lot of owners, it is a very, very heartbreaking situation having to give up their dog because they can't afford it anymore. Is there something beforehand, before we bring home a dog, in the mindset of people that would need to change or that you would like to emphasize more?
I am so glad that you asked this question, because I absolutely feel and believe that failed expectations are a large reason why we get returns or these serial dogs coming back over and over and over again. We definitely have to touch on that. So yes, absolutely. There are a lot of people who I feel mean absolutely well, but there are a lot of things that we need to consider when we're selecting a dog, as in what is our experience level with not just this breed, but this behavioral profile of dogs. So I would not recommend most of the Malinois that we see end up in our shelters for an inexperienced or first-time dog owner. That goes the same with any other working breed we see. With, of course, some exceptions. We do get some dogs that we feel, even though it's a husky, this looks like a much easier husky that may do well. Maybe they're older, they're in the sunset years of their life, but there's people that come into shelters or are looking, like you said, even from a breeder, for a dog that really isn't the best fit in terms of what they are comfortable handling and working with. What does your lifestyle look like? So we foster a lot of Malinois, and let me tell you, my exercise goes way up. Like, I completely understand that's what I'm getting into. That's what these dogs need. We're running or jogging like 6 to 9 miles a day, depending on what they want. And we cannot expect the dog to tailor its needs to fit our lifestyle. It has to be the other way around, or a two-way street. And you know, we have people living in smaller spaces, which can be okay if you set it up the right way and you're still providing everything that these dogs need day in and day out. But, you know, do you have children in the home? Are there senior citizens or other people that could be easily hurt by a dog that's very jumpy or mouthy, or perhaps has some aggression issues in the past? And I know we all feel, you know, for these dogs, we see their suffering, we feel pity for them, but we also can't be setting them up for failure and really bring that stress onto ourselves and our lives. You know, we can't provide the best care for these dogs if we're not feeling our best. Right. And so many times I feel we put ourselves in a position that we could have avoided if we would have looked at all these things beforehand. And definitely talk to, you know, whether it's a breeder or adoption counselors or volunteers that have taken these dogs home or have worked with them. Ask the right questions. So, you know, is this dog right for me? A lot of people also like to window shop. So they try to pick a dog that reminds them maybe of a dog they once had, or they're looking at a dog that's very rambunctious and playful, and they think that's what they want up until they get home and they're like, hey, I really actually wanted some, you know, slow potatoes guy who's going to just hang out and watch TV with me. But we can't do our best work in placing these dogs if we're not getting that honest feedback either. And it's okay if you can't have, you know, a V8 dog like a Malinois or a cattle dog or some other working breed. We can definitely set you up with something that's going to be a little bit better. And I think another thing too, just like you touched on, is, you know, the therapist role that we kind of expect our dogs to take on as well. They are sentient beings that deserve their own agencies as well. And if you're trying to hug and kiss a dog that really doesn't like physical affection and petting the way you want it to, we can run into a lot of issues and inadvertently set these dogs up for failure. Maybe now we have a bite and the dog was returned. And let me tell you, placing a dog that now has a bite on its record when it didn't, and all we had to do was respect its space and understand that this really isn't that type of dog, and that's okay. That can be very frustrating. So really taking that responsibility, looking inward and getting that genuine reflection as to, you know, what really would fit best in my lifestyle? What am I best suited for as a handler, as a guardian, as an owner? And how could I help this specific dog live its best life? Sometimes that's going to take a little bit of questions or meeting dogs multiple times. And that's okay. Take your time with this process. It's a big, big responsibility. And we really don't want to continue seeing this churn over and over of people adopting dogs and then returning them because it doesn't work out. If we would have taken a little bit more time with this process, we could have had a better outcome, I think.
Yeah. Some of the questions that needs to be asked, like you need to be obviously be honest to yourself. And I think with the excitement or the idea of having like a dog, and some people like, I only like big dogs, right? And like, I'm like that too. Although I can't wait when I'm retired, I'm going to get a little tiny dog that I can scoop up and just walk around with. I always wanted to do this.
Exactly.
I always end up with these big dogs one day. But anyways, sometimes, it's not just about having a big dog, right? It's kind of like everything that comes with this. And even within the same breed, you can have a lot of different personalities that you really need to ask yourself, in the worst case scenario, am I prepared for it or not? Or if not, what can I do if I really, really want this? I want to touch on something that I've been thinking about a lot, because you mentioned as soon as there is a bite history on the records, it's going to get really tough. And I've been thinking about this a lot because to me, as a neuroscientist or someone that thinks about the neurobiology of all the behaviors, including aggression and bite a lot, I've been thinking about this so much that aggression and bite has become so normalized for me that is just like, oh, this is what dogs do, right? And then obviously this situation can be very severe if a kid is involved and whatnot. But then one of the first things, if it's being reported, is, animal control comes in, these dogs are quarantined, sometimes for weeks until the process gets started to actually evaluate or not, right? And then whether or not the dog is deemed dangerous or not. And there's so many really, really interesting studies, and they come to light more and more because, it starts out with studies in the fruit fly, and then it comes further down to mammals and monkeys and whatnot. We know that for social animals, and this is nothing new for you, or we all know that, but we know we have really clear neurobiological evidence for it, for social animals that are being isolated. A lot of things happen. One of the things is some chemicals are literally increased in the brain that signal to the brain, this is not a good situation for you. You're socially isolated. And if it's very short term, like a dog that is like my dog is right now in the crate. She's not really socially isolated because I'm here, but during the day, 3-4 hours, she's by herself. And then she comes out and is very motivated to do things that I need her to do. But for longer, days and weeks, that becomes the opposite. And it kind of turns into aggression. So the motivation for social interaction can turn into motivation for aggression. Now, in the system, that's the system. So we put dogs that have potentially a bite, may not have been the dog's fault. Now it goes in quarantine because we need to figure out if the dog is dangerous, and we potentially make the dog dangerous because now all the stress and being... So a long story, but my question is, that's a problem. Do you think it's a problem? And what would need to happen to set up this whole process a little bit more for success, not just for the dog, but for everyone involved?
Shout out to our good friend Cortisol, just sticking the fingers in all our dogs, sprinkling that fun everywhere. Such a great question. It is something that I am thankful is becoming more involved in our day-to-day discussions and conversations. I hear it as a topic that's frequently discussed now in multiple conferences and seminars involving shelter and rescue work. And it's absolutely a problem in these dogs that come in with a bite, and also the ones that are deemed aggressive at first contact or during intake. Now shelter staff, volunteers are hesitant removing this dog from its kennel, even though that intake process might have been acutely distressful. Again, we are bringing in these dogs to a very loud facility. They really don't know what's going on or what's happening to them, and often they will respond in these ways. So we really have to start this behavioral support at the very beginning, at first contact with any dog, regardless of whether they came in on bite quarantine, They are expressing or exhibiting fearful or aggressive responses with staff or volunteers, any handlers or caretakers, or even if they're friendly. I often see dogs come in, they're okay for the first couple of days. Once they understand and start adjusting to this very stressful environment, we see a very quick decline. So we need to start this intervention very early on. We need to start establishing very positive associations and experiences with every dog we come in contact to. And one very simple technique that I recommend is simply giving treats out as you're passing by the kennels, even if the dogs are barking, even if they're lunging, even if they're growling and snapping. Because again, these behaviors could be just manifestations or responses rooted in stress, rooted in anxiety and fear. These dogs really struggling to cope with this new environment and life, regardless if they have a low biological predisposition for that resilience, or they just weren't able to cope starting at that point in time, or they've been there for that long. So this really simple exercise of giving that dog a brief but positive interaction every time you pass by. And we can hang these little treat bowls outside of the kennel. We can carry our treat pouches with us. And also really, if we're dealing with dogs that we feel are unsafe to remove at that time, or we're really unsure. And unfortunately, many shelters do not have behaviorists or trainers that are comfortable coming in and knowledgeable enough to evaluate or assess or analyze these behaviors specifically for shelter dogs. Yes. So they are left in a position where they see a dog that's behaving aggressively. They don't know what to do because they don't have that knowledge and skill set equipped. So the dog just stays there. So in my mind, there's still all of these things that we can be doing, even if you don't feel safe taking that dog out. So I always recommend increasing in-kennel enrichment. If we can get a weight on that dog and get it started on psychopharmacology, that is always something that I recommend these veterinary teams discuss. I'm not a veterinarian. I do not recommend psychopharmacology. I recommend discussing that possibility with the veterinary team. And I think it's important that staff, behaviorists or trainers, and veterinary staff work together and collaborate in creating these behavior modification plans for these dogs. And while their kennels are being cleaned and they're giving food, that's a really great time to start incorporating lots of different enrichment activities for them to at least express in some species-specific behavior. But I think every shelter, to be honest, needs to have very solid behavioral support. So someone who is knowledgeable in fear and aggression and can work with these dogs and really differentiate, especially we get some dogs with very severe histories, and we're not given a lot of details. So we don't know what happened in the home or what the circumstances were. And shelter staff say, this dog was great. They haven't done anything to us. There's been no aggression in the home. So what do we do? And that's a very hard position that these shelters are placed in, because their main mission or focus is public safety. So that's why shelters were created. They cannot, under that liability of government work, place dogs that will be a danger to the public. And unfortunately, there are some that come in. Do I feel that's the majority of dogs that I work with, even behavior cases? No. I do believe that most of the behaviorally challenged dogs that we see in shelters are struggling because of the circumstances, experience, and environment that they're in. But it's a very fine line to tread, definitely. But if we view behavior holistically and really through the lens of wellness, there is a lot that we can be doing in the meantime while we try to change those behaviors, those associations, at least to the point where the dog is now safe to take out and evaluate in a different environment. Because again, it's not fair that we look at a kennel and say, this is a true temperament, this is a true disposition. So just working with techniques that will allow you to safely get the dog out of that environment into a yard, some nice outdoor space, and relax and enjoy some time finally outside, I think should be the biggest focus.
Yeah, I agree. I like how you said that no matter what kind of behavior the dog shows at intake, you have to approach this from, we're going to make this dog a friend, or like show that we are friends, right? And not let our own fear and hesitation take over, which is probably really hard, because anyone who's gotten bitten by a big dog knows it's a very unpleasant experience, and it's not fun, right? But that goes into, the role of the shelter and the education that goes in there. What is your day-to-day, like an average, or I don't know, I don't even call it average because you're kind of working with dogs that are on the euthanasia list. And I will touch on euthanasia in a second, but what does your day-to-day life look like?
So I generally go to different shelter sites throughout the day. And right now our main focus, just because of the amount of dogs coming into shelters, has been behavioral analysis, evaluations or assessments. So people often use those terms interchangeably. I'll be given a list of dogs that are either already on the pathway for euthanasia, or staff and volunteers are starting to see some behaviors that are concerning, or they're wondering whether or not this is safe, or trying to figure out how to work with this dog continuously. So I'm given this list. I go and one by one start working with these dogs, and it can be quite challenging when you have a large list and not a lot of time. You also want to give these dogs a fair chance too. Yeah. I don't like to rush assessments. If it takes me an hour or more to work with one dog to really get a feel of what I feel is their true disposition, temperament, triggers, strengths, and weaknesses, then I'll take that time. And oftentimes for those shifts, I will see fewer dogs. And the next day, I'll have those added to that day's list. And it can be very, very challenging, but I don't like to rush things. I don't like to work in large volumes. I really like to give each dog a fair chance. And most of the time it does take between 1 and 3 sessions to get a dog out of its kennel and into a yard where it's feeling more comfortable. I definitely approach evaluations very, very differently than what's being taught right now currently for animal shelters. So there are a lot of setting up a dog in different scenarios or situations and gauging how their response is. And I feel, unfortunately, a lot of these scenarios, like handling sensitivity tests, are inadvertently setting up these dogs for failure. So I've seen a lot of videos where we're tethering a dog to a wall on a very short leash, and then we use this fake Assessa hand. So it's like a rubber hand on a stick that doesn't look like a hand at all. It doesn't smell or move. It's not attached to us. And, we're approaching these dogs and poking them, and a lot of dogs are going to snap at this, even though they are fine being handled and pet. And now they're labeled handling sensitive or aggressive, rescue only, or on the pathway to euthanasia. So I could talk for hours on our evaluation process, but we're very much on an approach of following the Lima philosophy. So least invasive, minimally aversive. That way we can ease into these tests or these snapshots in time while still meeting all the needs of these dogs. My goal is to get them out of the kennel and into the yard, and then we just hang out. I mean, my fiance loves to laugh and says, you get paid to just sit with dogs or play with dogs. And I do laugh too, but that is a lot of what we do because that's what they need. And that's what is the true personality of this dog too. They really are friendly. They really are playful and goofy and joyful and lively, but we weren't able to see that before. And if I were to move in really quickly with touching these dogs and trying to hug them and restrain them, or have them meet another dog right away, that can give us a very different response. And if we were to have set it up in what we would view as normal circumstances, we're removing these dogs from an abnormal environment and trying to judge them based on this very abnormal environment. That's not going to give us a very genuine reflection. Yeah. So really, I spend my days working with these dogs one by one. And we train volunteers and staff as well. So we do provide courses. These are on a less frequent basis. So we'll often schedule these for once, twice, 3 times a month. And we'll go over everything from reading canine body language, defensive handling tips, how to work with fearful dogs, how to improve that meet and greet process. So the right questions to ask so we can all come to the conclusion that we all want for these dogs. But a lot of it is one-on-one work. We do run play groups a lot too, but it is really evaluating and working with them in a way that is as kind and empathetic as possible. So if you guys have seen my work, we don't use a lot of hard pressures or obedience in our behavior modification. We take it nice and slow and just support these dogs so we do see them blossom and that personality come out. And that to me is when we hit that transformation point, it is everything I want to see for every dog. And that's the reason why I keep going. And it can be tough, not every dog makes it every day. And if I'm working with a new volunteer, I do let them know, like, we may work with some dogs today that may not make it, and we have to be okay with that. But really the successes and that joy is what keeps driving this work. Is we do see that possibility. We do see these great outcomes, these fantastic outcomes, not just for the dogs, but for the people that join their lives as well. It's a beautiful thing to see.
It is. Yeah. You're saying so many things, and I have already so many ideas. What I wanted to follow up with. And I couldn't agree more when you said the evaluation protocols, the standard evaluation protocols are flawed in many different ways. And when they have been established, I don't even know when exactly, but probably it's some time back in the days when you didn't have the information we have now. And also the culture and the environment has changed so dramatically that it is more, again, just like with the quarantine, sometimes setting the dog up for failure and then putting a flag on that behavior. And you can push any dog to a certain point to show a certain behavior. It's almost asking for the dog. And I talked for a short time period here in Atlanta, I was on the board of a rescue organization. I did the same thing. I was evaluating the incoming dogs, and I talked to vets, and for them is they have to just have a quick test so they know how to handle when they actually have to handle the dog, right? So I understand where they're coming from. The problem is that, and I think this is where, for me, really understanding the nitty gritty part of the brain, how even for us humans, we are not very different when we evaluate these kind of new situations that we find ourselves in, because these kind of brain areas that respond to fight or flight are very conserved and preserved across species. So whenever there's something unknown for the dog, and just entering the shelter is already an unknown situation, let alone this fake hand that smells like rubber glove, whatever, and everyone holding their breath at the same time and being super tense. So everything is just sending alarming signals to the dog. And the amygdala, the fight or flight center and emotional center, for everything new, the amygdala's job is to create a branch. And this branch is it a threat or is it safe? And that kicks in every single time something is new. The threshold for whether or not it's a threat depends on the dog's personality. But again, in a very stressful situation, a lot of dogs, but even for us humans, we will go to, well, we got to be a little more careful here. This might be a threat. So we don't really evaluate what we think we are evaluating. We don't evaluate whether the dog under normal situations is actually touch sensitive. What we do is saying, what's the threat response if we present a threat to a dog? And this is a very, very different evaluation. And unless it's in a normal situation where the dog has at least a little bit of a familiar understanding of, oh, I can run on the green grass area and I can be normal, then you can throw in little tests. And it's probably what you are doing is oh, what if you walk by me and I just stride your back? Are you touch sensitive or whatnot, right? When you came over to me, these kind of things are much more informative than artificially set up, because again, what we're actually testing is something completely different in those situations.
Yes. And I love what you said about veterinarians, especially in the shelter industry, having to go in and quickly evaluate and work with the dog in many situations, especially with this high of volume. We don't have all the time in the world to build this really strong relationship with the dog kennel sign in order for them to allow handling, restraint, or any diagnostic tests. So that is something that I focus on too. If taking a dog straight from the kennel out into the yard for 3 minutes will make that much of a difference between their sensitivities for handling or restraints, maybe we can take that 3 minutes. Maybe we can set up our systems and protocols in a way that we've got almost a chain of, one handler taking the dog out into the yard, then that person returning the dog over back to the clinic while the first handler takes another dog out, and kind of that conveyor belt system in a way that we're still at least trying to meet the biological and psychological and emotional needs of these dogs before going forward with the vet treatments, because that is something that I see oftentimes, and it is a very valid concern. If we don't have a lot of time for each dog, really shouldn't we be looking at how they're able to be handled in these quicker situations or higher pressure situations? And that is something that I look for. But again, my focus isn't just what's going to cause this dog to fail. It's how do we help this dog succeed? And I think that mindset switch or shift is incredibly important. And we absolutely need to talk about that.
And I also like how you said, obedience. I don't think also obedience is not necessarily the first thing that a dog needs to learn in the shelter. Probably not the first thing the dog needs to learn 3 months after being adopted either. Because behavior and obedience, the way you can train behavior is very similar to the way you train obedience, but the over-reliance of obedience to say this is a good dog is a problem, even in the pet dog world. What is the ideal transition from being in the shelter to may or may not a foster in between to being adopted? And here I mean around like the timeline, what the adopters can expect to see or what they have to go through, maybe the investment of time, potentially money. Like what is the ideal situation, and then where are the main challenges? Where does things kind of break?
Yes. So many of us have heard of the 3-3-3 rule. So 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months. I think that is a very good guideline, but I do caution people that this is just a guideline. So the individual needs of each dog varies depending on who we're talking about. But I think the approach and the mindset concerning and revolving this is excellent. It's a great place for people to start. Is even though we are removing the dog from a highly stressful situation, the second it comes to our peaceful, loving, fun home is not the second we're going to see this incredible change. Oh my God, they're just going to come out of their shell. And I feel a lot of people, and I'm the same way, right? We oftentimes like to show our affection through physical touch and petting. And what I've learned recently is with these cortisol spikes too, that can have lasting effects, days, weeks, months, even after a long event or a long stay at a shelter. So really keeping that in mind, we love to tell people, allow the dog to get used to the environment and routine first, then to the people. So it's caregivers, it's guardians, it's owners, and then to other animals and other dogs in the home. So one big mistake I see people often making when they bring a new dog home from the shelter is they just let it loose. They allow it to just greet the dogs and the kids and everyone, and, just hug it and pet it and stick your face in its head. And, it will know that you saved it, because obviously this is a much better environment than the shelter. But you really have to understand that everything has changed for them once again. So they had to adjust to the shelter environment, and now they're having to adjust to your home. So a lot of these dogs were forced to defecate and urinate in their kennels, in their small areas. They may not show housebreaking tendencies, even if they were previously considered housebreaking in another home or with a foster. And we have seen so many cases where, multiple trainers have seen a dog, whether in a private client setting or in a shelter, and they've recommended euthanasia. And all we did in our home was leave the dog alone. Like if I had one statement and one thing tattooed on my arm or on a sweater, t-shirt, on my hat, is just leave them alone. Let them adjust at their own pace. These dogs will let you know, they'll communicate with you how willing and ready they are to continue on to each step, to start engaging with their new owners, their new household members, the other dogs, and really just allowing them that patience that they absolutely need to become comfortable and confident with all these changes going on. And I love to tell people, just set up a little area in your home and make it nice and comfortable, and just let your dog take everything in as you go about your day. If your dog wants to engage, you can do so in a manner that is consent-based and very respectful, but just taking it slow. So many people rush this process. And, for some dogs, this may take months. It can take up to a year where they're not very comfortable depending on also not just the shelter experience, but the home that they came from beforehand. So many dogs that come into shelters were backyard dogs. So that is one thing that the stats are telling us is the behavior profile of shelter dogs. Most are under 2 years, most are intact, and most have never seen a veterinarian or a trainer before. And most have are exclusively backyard dogs. So now imagine bringing this dog into a home setting and you have all these expectations. Hey, you can't dig through the trash. You can't pee in the home or mark on anything. You can't jump and knock things over, but they've never been exposed to these things. And really approaching this in a way where we're patient, we're structuring our home and setting it up in a way that we're preventing that failure. So keeping your trash secured, keeping dogs out of bathrooms and kitchens, and making sure that we guide and coach children. That's such a big factor for a lot of these dogs that, like you said, may have never been exposed, have never seen children before. They don't view children in the same way as adults. Children sound different, they move different, they smell different. Everything about them is different. So if this dog has never had exposure, even positive experiences to something that's now in your household, really forcing or pressuring interactions can really lead to conflict. And we think a lot of times it is inevitable. So really becoming educated, setting up your home for success. So dog proofing and making sure everything is set up before you bring these dogs home, and just giving this dog their space, allowing them to decompress. They're going to sleep a lot, most of them. Leave them alone, let them rest. Don't do these drive-by pettings when they're sleeping comfortably in their bed for the first time in weeks or months. I think that is literally the make or break point that we have seen over and over again with these shelter and rescue cases.
I often say for dogs that you don't know yet, or you don't know the history, or just with puppies even, right? It's limiting the choices, and it's a safe bet to say, if given the chance, your dog is likely to make the wrong choice, not because your dog wants to make a wrong choice, but just because how animals go, right? If given access to the trash can, your dog is probably going for the trash can. You can't get mad at it unless, there's been a lot of training involved. And I don't even mean like you, from the very beginning, you punish your dog for going through. This is not an empathetic way of thinking about how you set up the right environment, right? Or given like access to the backyard, your dog is probably going to make the wrong choice and dig up your beautiful flowers that you planted and took care of for the last month, right? So it's like, for me, it's like, always, how many choices do I give my dog? And are these all good choices? Are these potentially bad choices? Am I okay if the dog makes a bad choice? And all these things come in. And that kind of guides your way, because then you start not being so upset about everything's going wrong. And it might be the wrong dog. It's just, it takes time. You got to set it up the right way.
They don't know any better. It's really, especially when you get so involved in the shelter world, you see where these dogs come from. The idea that your dog will just know the expectations and rules of your home is not going to happen. It's going to be different in every household. Different people allow different things. So just like you said, setting it up in a way that the dog will be successful. And it's a big thing. And I know we mean well, right? Like, welcome home, but we have to really view it from a different point.
We have to sometimes just let go of humanization of the dogs and just kind of just go a little back. It's still an animal in that way. Let's talk about euthanasia. So it's obviously a very tricky topic. And, I sometimes go down this rabbit hole of like, how do I look at euthanasia so that it makes sense? And I think it's very hard because the situation is not just the dog, but it's actually the context, right? It's not just the dog being potentially not adoptable to others, but in a very overfilled shelter with like a huge city attached to it, and there's no way to go. So many things go into this. So what is your thought on euthanasia? Is it like black and white saying yes, no? Is it in some circumstances actually not just needed, but a relief for the dog? What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, thank you so much for asking this. And I know this can be a difficult topic for a lot of people. And, as we were discussing before, some of the hardest conversations are the most important ones to have, especially in the shelter industry, because we all need to be aware of what's going on and the crisis that we really are in. So we're not ignoring it and thinking that everything is roses and daisies and, oh, it'll be fine if I just take my dog to a shelter. And I know you pointed out before, even friendly dogs do start to deteriorate rather quickly. Some that have low resilience, some that just cannot cope in this very stressful environment. And, it's not a black or white thing. Even among the shelter industry, different shelters will have different protocols or different ways they approach behavioral euthanasia. And that oftentimes depends on, the resources that this shelter has, the amount of staff and volunteers and the amount of dogs they have. So if you have a lot of volunteers that are able and willing to work with dogs kennel side while the staff continue with their routines and duties throughout the day, if you have shelters with a relatively low amount of dogs, you have more time to work with them. But that's unfortunately not what we're seeing right now. So many of the shelters are operating over capacity. So rather than having full kennel runs, they are now split in half with the guillotine door. These dogs are given even more restriction in the space, and the level of noise is increased, the level of stress and chaos. And there are multiple things that we have to consider when we are discussing behavioral euthanasia from the shelter standpoint. So very, very different from a client setting. These dogs aren't already in a home. They don't already have an adopter, owner, or guardian. The shelter's job when the dog becomes their custody after that point is to try and place the dog. But as I said before, their primary mission is public safety. Shelters cannot increase their liability by placing dogs that are dangerous out into the public. And I know we all want to save as many as possible, but we also have to come to terms that we cannot save every single dog the way it's at. If we were to just hold on to every dog that we got in until maybe it got adopted, and even that's not a guarantee, with the resources available now, that standard of care would plummet even lower than what we're seeing now. And we're struggling already. And coupled with these decisions of, whether a dog is aggressive or not, if a dog comes in with multiple bites, if it mauled the child, if there's severe damage done to a person, it killed other dogs, other livestock, other animals, if it's having high escape tendencies where it's difficult for the person to manage or control, if there are possibilities or a behavioral history of redirection, or the dog now, having aggressive responses towards its own owner and its own household. There's so many different factors that we have to take into consideration. And unfortunately, there's so many times where we do have to make tough decisions. And it's not to say that we want to. I don't think any shelter wants to put down a large amount of animals. And it takes such a massive emotional and physical and psychological toll on their caretakers. They bond with these dogs. They work with them. And sometimes then I have, a tattoo. One of my first ones was a dog that I worked with for 6 or 7 months. And he bonded with me, but he was never able to generalize that association with anyone else. And I couldn't adopt the dog where I was at in my life. So, we elected behavioral euthanasia for him, and we still try to honor them as much as possible. I am EBI certified, so I can administer the injection, euthanasia by injection, and I volunteered to do it myself because I wanted this dog's final moments to be with someone that loved him and with someone who he trusted and felt safe with, and inside I'm battling with these feelings of incredible guilt and remorse. And I'm just walking this poor dog to his death. And he's like, hey, where are we going today? That you can only imagine carrying that grief day in and day out. And I wasn't the one who put this dog in this situation. We're all just trying our best. Right. But people do need to understand the way things are now, we are left with very tough decisions. And oftentimes, like you said, your second question, we will see this deterioration in these dogs. And I cannot tell you how heartbreaking it is to come into work and see the same dog losing his mind day in and day out. And we've done everything we can.
Right.
And we understand that, we've reached out to rescues. There's no out for this dog. And if the puppies aren't even getting adopted, this dog's not going to make it out.
Yeah.
And that's the unfortunate reality of a lot of shelters in California, in Texas, in Florida. I mean, we are over capacity. So just like you said, it is sometimes the nicest thing we can do to let them go. Yeah. And when you see a dog that's lost a third of its body weight, has no hair left, and sees no relief, and we have to look at ourselves and say, is it time to let them go? And sometimes it is. And again, it's not what we want. It's not what we wanted. And we tried for a different outcome, but when only one dog is getting adopted and 20 are coming in that day, that's unfortunately where we're at. Yeah. And it can be such a difficult pill for people to swallow, but that's the reality of it. And until that changes, our intakes and numbers and the resources that we have available to truly provide the care that these dogs need, that's going to continue to be the unfortunate case. But I appreciate you bringing that up. And I know that can be tough for a lot of people to hear, but, it's tougher for us on the front lines and having to work with these cases day in and day out. I tell people I cry every day on my way home, and it's just my way of letting go of that grief and processing it. So the next day I can do it all over again. It's hard.
Yeah. This idea, no kill shelters, again, is a nice idea, but it just doesn't align with reality. And maybe there was a time when it wasn't such an overload with dogs in shelters, but it's not just, again, the question is, do you put a dog for years and years and years and years that is clearly stressed and can't handle the stress in the shelter to hope there is an adoption or not, right? And what is really the right decision here to make? What is the decision for the dog, even if that means taking life, right? And at the same time, for everyone who tries so hard for a very, very, very difficult dog, and then experts not really seeing any progress or not seeing where this goes, the resources, the time, the effort that you put in as someone who deals with them, there are so many other dogs who may have a better chance, who need you at the same time. So you also have to make the decision, right? Like, where do I put my time? And that's becomes such a complicated topic. And whether this is always the right decision, I think is something that no one knows ever, right? Because there could always be, maybe in the next day there would have been someone, right? But you can't approach it that way, because that just most of the time puts us in more trouble than what we are in already.
Absolutely. I 1000% agree. And that can be different for a different dog or a different shelter or a different time. Like you said, I think that may have worked before, but that's definitely not what we're seeing now. And it's not fair to warehouse dogs for the amount of time we're needing to now. Yeah. And like you said, maybe we're wrong. And I absolutely feel that I have made the wrong choice at times. I'm only human too. And there's we can't predict the future, but we can at least try. Like, we can try with every new case, every new day. And unfortunately, that's the reality. I appreciate you touching on that.
Yeah. I have two more questions for you. We're already longer than I would anticipate. But again, I kind of knew that was going to happen because it's such an important topic. I got asked this a lot on the comments when I announced this interview with you. What are the first steps someone would want to take if that person would like to pursue a similar line of work or career that you are having? So this could either be, I get, for example, a lot of students that they might finish up their studies in dog behavior, canine science, or just volunteers that are already working in shelters, and they kind of want to take it to the next level. What would you recommend are the next steps? So how do you get there?
Yes. So definitely having a mentor or someone that you can partner with helps a lot. Mm-hmm. And that is something that we have been currently developing is this curriculum of coursework for any shelter to follow, regardless if they have 2 volunteers or 300 at their specific facility. But I just kind of fell into this, and I get asked that question a lot. But there is such a big need for this. I think volunteering is the best first step for everyone. So if you haven't had that exposure to the shelter industry and getting your feet wet with working with dogs in that kind of environment, sign up to volunteer at your local shelters. Start working with the staff there that at least partake in some behavior work, or the ones that participate most in the daily care of that animal. So a lot of shelters that don't already have behavior protocols or programs set up already, that's going to be a little bit more difficult. But you can work to establish something with these shelters if you start working together, utilizing some techniques and protocols where you start seeing that progress. Mm-hmm. So that progress is really what you want to show these shelters, and that you're able to do so they can buy into these programs. Because something that we run into too is shelters don't want more work. And if we're creating behavior plans and programs, that just adds all of this work to their days that are already filled with all these routine care tasks and everything else that they have to do day to day. They're not really going to buy into it or implement it into their programs or routines. And we completely understand that. So one easy way is just to start working with the easier dogs. And that's usually the path that most shelters have their volunteers take. And a lot of trainers do volunteer at shelters. If you're already involved in behavior work, this is such fantastic, great exposure to a wide variety of dogs. So we see everything from, backyard bred animals that were kept chained to trees in a backyard or somewhere for their entire lives, severe aggression, severe fear. We see some dogs that are displaying a feral level of fear. So those are some of my favorites to work with. And we do see them every now and then, but you get a lot more exposure that you may not see in the private client setting. So a lot of these owners or guardians, previous owners of these dogs, were never going to be the people that were taking their dogs to see a trainer anyway. So in order to get exposure to some of the more challenging cases, this creates a really good sample of dogs that you can pick and choose and grow. So start with what you feel comfortable and start taking on more and more challenging cases and work towards that outcome. And it will take working with the shelter management, shelter staff as well. And just, keep really good communication, a really good relationship with them. That is something that I do want to caution is we often see a culture of volunteers versus staff in shelters. Mm-hmm. And they have very different experiences and exposures to the dogs in their care. So staff have very different expectations of their duties and jobs compared to volunteers. Volunteers are also coming, free of charge. They are giving up their own time to come work with these dogs. So rather than create contention and conflict, we can all work together for a better future for these dogs. So it can definitely depend. We always recommend people reach out to us too. So we do offer mentorships. If anyone is in the Northern California area or throughout the state, we would be happy to work with you one-on-one. So if you want to get that exposure with shelter dogs, we offer that as well. But this is a fairly new approach and mindset that we're seeing is, these shelters dogs don't just need veterinary support, they need behavioral support as well. Yeah. So it can take some tweaking and a lot of communication and not pressure, but just stay consistent. Just keep pushing and say, this is something that I'm interested in. I can offer my help. How can I start? And volunteering is the best way to go, unless you're shelter staff. So if, this is a great opportunity for people coming out of school too, if you're not really sure what to do, or you're just looking for a job that will pay relatively well in some areas. I know not in others, but also offer benefits that's relatively secure and safe. This is a great way to start. So a lot of people start as care staff and then grow from there. And as they're getting exposed to these behaviors, it just takes off. So lots of different ways, but just keep at it. Be persistent.
Keeping at it. And even though there might be probably a lot of people who say no to you or slam the door in front of your nose, just keep trying. During my time, as I was working with these rescue dogs coming in, evaluating them, I learned things that I would have not learned if I would just have done the in-person training with a dog who was living already a really pretty good life at home. And one of the big things that I had learned is how to keep it as simple as possible so everyone can understand it, including the dog, and yet make some progress in the right direction. Because we tend to overcomplicate things when it comes to, we mentioned before, all the obedience and all the things that a dog can do that is not necessarily appropriate for a shelter dog, just to not overwhelm the dog. So that was a very, very interesting lesson to be learned. Like, how can I keep it simple? What do I have? What does every shelter have? Resources are limited. People are not always having the time to sit down and go through, the 10 steps of training ABCD, right? So that experience is going to be very, very valid too.
Absolutely.
Okay, so last question. What keeps you up at night? What is it that bothers you the most?
So I'll answer this in two ways, personally and professionally, because I think they're a little bit different. Personally, it's often when I don't take a dog home and I could have. So I have not had my own dog in over 3 years now because my fiance and I decided we would just foster. Mm-hmm. Fostering perpetually in such a high volume takes a lot out of us. It's very, very taxing. We have to start over with dogs constantly and having to help them adjust. A lot of housebreaking accidents. They're not used to the noise. They're up at night too. So during times when I feel I have to take care of myself and get the sleep that I need and not have to wake up and, do they need to go to the bathroom? And I have my own health issues I need to take care of. And that guilt can be very, very difficult for me to work through. It's impossible for me not to take my work home, both physically, like literally and figuratively. But that I feel I'll often wake up and, that dog that I was thinking of taking home, he's in that kennel right now. He's surrounded by noise. He's not relaxing and I'm just here in bed. How is that fair? So that's been quite a bit of a mindset shift for me is I cannot pour from an empty cup and I have to take care of myself in order to take care of these animals. Professionally, it is the kind of no end in sight right now. Throughout the years and decades, I think we've been waiting for that moment where we feel we have caught up and we are nowhere near that point. And that is so frightening to me, especially with the way things are going with the economy and inflation. We foresee this getting much worse before it gets much better. And we are not at a point where we have, states providing funding, federal government providing funding to help support shelters in more underserved communities, especially. So what are we going to do? And I feel our response has been so reactionary rather than proactive and really anticipating. We know what's going to happen in terms of jobs and people's housing and their ability to care for these dogs responsibly. So what are we doing about it now? And we feel like our message is getting to the people that already know this and already are aligned with our vision and our views, but we're not getting to the people that need to hear it most. And it starts by having conversations with our family members and friends and our neighbors and community members or work colleagues. We really have to get this out there. And I've seen billboards and, ads on newspapers and different publications on TV, on the radio, and we're still kind of at the same point. So that's kind of what is most challenging and keeping me up right now is, what are these next steps, these next few years going to look like? And, it can't be a burden that only a few carry and only a few care enough about to do something about it. These are community-wide issues. No shelter staff gave their own dog up. They're trying to take care of someone else's quote unquote problem. But until we all recognize and acknowledge that this is where we're at, I think I'm going to have a lot of sleepless nights.
It sounds like it. That's maybe it's obviously very sad to hear, but this is something that you experience and foresee happening, meaning not enough change. I feel like history repeats itself, or like other issues that are just in a similar ways. Like we know, but we don't do enough. But maybe making it like raising this red flag and bringing it more forward, more people that think they're not involved, are somehow involved too, because I don't know. I feel like in America, everyone at some point thinks about getting a dog. It's just it's inevitable. So kind of everyone, whether it's 3 years from now or not, it already affects you, your knowledge, your education, what decision you're going to make 3 years from now, right? So I think everyone should hear that for sure.
And definitely, this doesn't mean you have to adopt, right? Get your dog from a breeder, a responsible breeder if you'd like, but think about, what do I need to do now to prevent my dog from ending up in the shelter in the first place? That is what we need to focus on, rather than these easy fixes of, hey, just ban all breeding. That's not what's going to fix this issue. I can tell you that right now. So everyone can play their part. And that was such a beautiful way that you worded that, is, at some point, I don't know of a single person that hasn't thought, I'd like to get a dog now. Yeah. And regardless of where you get that from, we can all play our part to create this better future for them.
Yeah. And you just said it, and maybe we have to stress that, just to not confuse the audience, because we only talked about shelter dogs. It doesn't mean you have to adopt a dog. It doesn't mean a shelter dog is the right dog for you. Yes. And in fact, what it does mean is, whatever is the right dog for you, you need to find out first, and then go to the source that can give you that. And if you're set up to shelter, get a shelter dog, and you feel like you want to take on a potential challenge, then that's for you. And if not, that's okay too, obviously. And just think not just about tomorrow, but the next 5 years and 10 years. And are you set up for success? And can you set up the dog for success? So it doesn't become a shelter dog, because they're beautiful breeders and they're doing wonderful work, and they're wonderful purebred dogs that obviously want to get into a home too.
Yes. Yeah.
All right, Sada, I think we are at the end. Thank you so much. I think there was a wonderful conversation, and I had so many more questions that are on my list that I will save maybe for the next time. And I'm pretty sure I will invite you back. There's more to come, and maybe we can see what kind of feedback we get and continue that conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a wonderful time, and I look forward to that.
Yes, awesome. Thank you so much.